Welcome to Content Disrupted, bold takes on brand marketing. I'm your host, Dan Baptiste, and together we'll explore what it takes to excel in brand marketing at one of the most exciting and disruptive times in industry history. Welcome to Content Disrupted, bold takes on brand marketing. With us today is Maxx Delaney, Creative Director for Quality Meats. Maxx has worked with brands in commoditized categories and spaces and found ways to help them stand out and get rewarded with outsized market share. Today, we as marketers find ourselves in a difficult position. With the explosion of channels, demands for personalization, confusion around AI, the challenge of standing out seems more complicated than it's ever been. But should it be? That's the question we'll discuss today. Welcome to the show, Maxx.
Thank you. It's good to be here.
Yeah, thanks. And why don't you start by quickly introducing yourself, sharing your background, and telling us the types of things that you work on.
Yeah, I'm an advertising creative director. Started a small agency, and I think I've gone back and forth from small to big to small to big. And like you said, now at Quality Meats Creative, where we are on the smaller side, but working with big brands and small brands to help them stand out in their space. I think coming into it, I didn't know how much I was interested in the brand strategy and positioning side and understanding how much creative goes into finding the right position for a brand. And in the process of learning this job and growing in the ranks and taking on more responsibility, learning that is maybe the most fascinating part of the job for me is helping brands unlock that position at a high level that can really inform how they behave at every touch point and help really set a kind of North Star for how they behave both internally and externally to help them become the brand that they want to be.
That's really interesting. And you mentioned over 12 years, you've discovered this path for yourself. Is that just due to the progression in your career and forcing you to do that? Or did something happen that sparked that exploration for you?
I think it's just maybe it was a natural part of just the growing process. I think when you start out, I only have my perspective, but starting out in my career, you are so low on the totem pole that the work you're doing, it's hard to get the perspective to see that impact on the business and on even the people that are on the other side of the conference call at that time. There was just a moment, I think, halfway through my career where I looked up from my desk and asked, is any of this working? And it was part of the, I think, impetus to lead me to a bigger agency that helped brands at more levels, help brands with media, help brands with strategy, help brands with SEO optimization across all of these places so that when you did unlock a brand positioning or even just take a brand's position and help them optimize it and scale it and revise it, you got to see a little bit more of what that did for the brand. And I think the creative side of advertising is a great space to be if you're a creative person that likes writing for a living, art directing for a living, creating things for a living. But it also is this intersection of also solving business problems for a living and doing creative work to do that. Seeing that actually result in business growth is a reward that I didn't really know that I would really come to love so much. And so the more that I got the opportunity to do that, the more I raised my hand to do that, the more I just tried to get into the rooms and the conversations where that was being worked on. I think the more that I just started to know that was the thing I liked the most about the job.
Yeah, you make an interesting point there. As we think about being trapped 2 layers down from the position, the story, the impact, and the question becomes, is this working? Are we chasing a channel? Are we chasing a tactic? Are we chasing an audience? Or are we creating a master position that can transform and get to the business outcomes you want? So I think we'll go much deeper there. But I think I'd like to hop to how we discovered you, which I think as a creative person must be the biggest compliment through your work, right? So we were looking at examples of great storytelling at a master position, and we came across Jefferson's Ocean, which is a bourbon distiller. And if you're like me and you walk down a liquor store aisle and you see dozens and dozens and dozens of bottles and like, how the heck do I choose which one I want? And I'm stuck with it because I'm not going to bury a bottle in a night. So I'm like, you look and say, is there a cool bottle? Is it price? Is it tasting? It was like, how do you choose? I feel the same way about craft beer, and I'm outing myself here, but it's a category that runs into that like sea of sameness. And like, how do you differentiate in what is a semi commoditized category and stand out? And you did that in a really amazing way. So can you just talk us through that work and how you did it and maybe the insight that drove that?
Yeah, I feel like it's important to mention that I had the opportunity to work at Jefferson's while I was working at Tombras, which is a growing company that they're doing great. I think they were Independent Agency of the Year last year. And while I was there, one of the main accounts that I ran along with all of the American whiskeys at Pernod Ricard was Jefferson's Bourbon. And Jefferson's Bourbon had an interesting story from the get-go that they were a company that was founded when bourbon was on a, I think, 20-year decline. It was a father-son, Chet and Trey Zoller, that decided that they were going to make a run for it in the bourbon space. And something that they did was they just did it a little bit different than the Kentucky bourbons that were very traditional single mash, not blended bourbon. And at a time when blending bourbon was frowned upon, they bought a lot of different barrels of bourbon, blended them together, found a good taste, and made their mark with an initial product that was a blended bourbon that just was a good price point for the quality. And that started them. Then I think what made them more interesting was the son, Trey, was just an adventurous guy. I think surfing in Costa Rica, had an idea for how you could age bourbon differently than the traditional warehouse in Kentucky, Rickhouse in Kentucky, and put some barrels of bourbon on a boat. That sort of rocking and the equatorial heat and the rocking of the boat created a little bit of an aging process inside that barrel. Liquid touching the oak, more rocking, a little bit more of that heat fluctuation, and created a different flavor profile of bourbon that you couldn't create in landlocked Kentucky. And I think out of that, not only was this product Jefferson's Ocean born, but there's also this point of view that bourbon can be more than Kentucky. Bourbon can be a product of place, that maturation isn't just about time spent in barrel, but where that barrel is and how that barrel behaves. So I think it just brought a point of view and a purpose to their product that was unique. So I think we were lucky to take a product that had a unique perspective, had something different about it, had a little bit of a built-in story, and then just help that brand find the confidence and the business strategy that made them comfortable to lean into that more and more. An old creative director who is leading Tombras right now, Jeff Benjamin, when we were working on that, would say, the truth is the best story we can tell for this brand. And I think that's a very lucky position to be in. Ideally, with any brand, you find the truth that is the best story to tell. But this was just to tell the story of how this product was made, the type of person that Trey is and was, to go out on a limb and do this, and the success that it's had. That became, I think, the backbone for how we positioned this brand for the years that I worked on it. And I think brought a lot of success and helped create a lot of content, and just, for lack of a better pun for a ocean brand, but just get them on the right course to growth. I think it was done with a lot of smart strategy that made it feel like it would have been a miss not to make it. And that, I think, is a big part of how you can get both sides of the table willing to hold hands and make that leap into some great creative work together.
So you mentioned having this creative carry for a couple of years in essence, right? Just for those listening, the output that got us really excited, one is the comprehensiveness of the creative and how the story materialized across different channels and just how powerful it was. And there's moments in the story, we'll drop a link in the bio, where there's some drama where the barrel opens up and it's not exactly what you expect and what happens, and you have the world watching, right? So there's interest in the story and there's depth and length to the story. And can you just talk about the centerpiece of the deliverable, which in this case was different flavors or lengths of a documentary that then was the springboard for the creative? So can you just describe that quickly?
Yeah, number one, I think it's just a testament to their team that in a time when attention is so fragmented and short form is king, they believed in the story enough to do a long form feature documentary on the story of Jefferson's Ocean and the story of Jefferson's as a brand. And we set out to make this, and I think we wanted to ideally have it be 3 to 5 minutes of content that we planned to break out into 4 shorter form pieces that I think we hope to be 30 seconds to a minute. And we ended up with, I think, a nearly 9 minute piece, if I'm not mistaken. And the amount of content we could have cut out of that, I feel like was nearly endless. And the amount of stuff we left on the cutting room floor that didn't make it into that final 9 minutes is, I think we had another probably 9 usable minutes. And we did make the short form cut downs, and we did end up making a 30-second version that I believe ran on some OLV. The natural magic of a production is that it never is exactly what you expect. And in this instance, it was better than we expected. And we got a lot more than we hoped. And then it actually, the biggest challenge after the fact became, how can we use all of this, or how can we use as much of this as possible? I bet if we wanted to, we could go back into that footage and cut a whole nother piece with what we didn't use still, and it would be a new side of the story that people haven't heard. So again, that's just a testament to the story, but I think also just the preparation and the way that we went about telling it that got us more than we could use.
Yeah, I think telling the story is really important. And you mentioned courage to play with format in length. I went to the YouTube video of the longer one this morning and just grabbed some comments because I think it's really fascinating. One, there's thousands of views on this long form documentary, but every time I watch this video, I get a new appreciation of Trey and the founding of Jefferson's. He has a great mind for the bourbon he creates. I got Jefferson's Ocean mainly because of the story, but the whiskey is just as good as the story. Good purchase. Can't wait to get the other expressions. Great video, better bourbon, freaking brilliant work. So you're seeing these comments of people loving it, but more importantly, going out and seeking out the product because of the video and the story that you're telling and inviting people into that story, which I think is fascinating. We did a couple of years ago or a few years ago, we co-authored a book called Storynomics. Part of that was looking at the brain science. So if you can tell somebody a story that they see themselves in, your neurons actually fire as if you're actually experiencing this yourself. So when you then go and purchase the bottle, you're reliving that experience. So I'm having a much more enjoyable experience drinking Jefferson's Ocean now that I know the story than if I just bought it randomly off. So not only are you driving preference, but you're changing the experience on how people actually taste and sip and appreciate that. And even this morning, I have a friend who doesn't even drink, and he's starting to think about his own story. And I sent him 2 versions, the 2 minute and the longer form. He's, man, I watched the longer form. It's amazing. Like, I don't even drink and I want to go out and buy this bottle of bourbon. So it's so powerful. The question I have is, you mentioned a built-in story with Jefferson's, and you were lucky to have that. Part of this, the art of this is when you think of brands that aren't Jefferson's, aren't a founder-led company, maybe a big enterprise or a division within a big enterprise, are there similar stories that they can unearth and tell that create a shared passion? Or is this a unicorn that's unique to Jefferson's?
No, I don't think it's unique to Jefferson's. I think every brand has a story. They started from somewhere. They were at first an idea that came a reality. Somebody or some people had to take a risk to do that. It may not be boats and sharks in Costa Rica and bourbon, but every brand has a truth that's, worth sharing and a story worth telling. I think as a creative, I don't think that there's a brand out there that couldn't do that. It feels like the advertising cliche to bring it up now, but you have a brand like Liquid Death who has brought a point of view in a story to something as simple as water. And everything that they do is from a very purpose-led truth. Mike Cesario started it because he felt a certain way about not only sustainable materials and doing right by the planet, but also working and living in an advertising space and in a skateboarding extreme sports space where there was a white space for the story, the truth that he had and the story that he was compelled to tell. And when you look around and say, can anybody do this? I'm not taking anything away from their talents. They're incredible. But I think there's no brand or space that I don't think could bring a unique story as long as it is coming from a place of truth. And I think that's the thing in strategy that you try to unearth the most is what is the truth about the brand and what is the truth about the consumer too? Because I would just say that going back to Jefferson's, one of the things that I think the strategists would love, you read those comments, and some of the strategists that worked on this brand would probably just light up ear to ear hearing that, because those are the things that we brought to the client beforehand to get them comfortable with producing this. That a large part of our bourbon drinkers are nerds. They want to know all the details. They want to know the story. They want to dig into it. They're willing to invest 9 minutes of their life before they buy that bottle of bourbon. And more so, not only, like you said, those mirror neurons, we're giving them the experience, but we're also giving them a little bit of currency so that when they pull their bottle of Jefferson's off the shelf at home, off their bar cart, they have a story to tell. They are inherently more interesting to their guests because they can tell this story of Jefferson's Ocean that they heard through our video. And then all of a sudden, like Trey's experience is their guest's experience. And that's something that I think when we brought this to them was a little bit of digging into what your consumer needs and what they want. What is their truth and how do we help them live it a little bit?
You mentioned truth, and a lot of this is in context with looking back. Today, a lot of times we're looking forward. And I think we're looking forward through maybe products or what do we need to accomplish or what is the urgency of today. If we're looking back, do you use that as a tool to create truth around your DNA as a company so that you can look forward? Or are you truly just saying, let's go back and tell who we are and what we stand for? Or can you use that as a springboard to say why we matter and what we can do with the tool skills and who we are as a brand, as a company, and as a community with our customers to maybe do something new, interesting, and different that aligns with the brand? Is it just to look back, or can you also use that to propel yourself forward?
I think it has to be a combination of the two. If you are going to look back, it should only be as a means of helping your consumers understand your positioning and how your brand can help them in the present or future. For something like bourbon, which is a product of the past, every barrel of bourbon has been aging for at least 3 years. Jefferson's 8, 12 years. You have to a little bit look back to really tell the story of the present because it didn't emerge overnight. I think there are certain brands who probably don't have to look back at all. They can talk about what they're doing today and what they're doing tomorrow because they're a more forward-thinking brand. Tech brands, I don't think, would be looking back much at all. You'd be talking about antiquated technologies unless it's a little bit of just how this brand got here. I think it's really about what your consumer cares about a little bit. So with bourbon, there's a little bit more of a tradition and a heritage to it. So it feels natural to talk about where it came from and where it's going. I think Jefferson's bourbon, as much as we did talk about the past in that video, their whole positioning when we worked with them was where shall we go? And it was always looking forward to the next adventure. And I think especially for brands who are not as heritage based, I don't know if looking back is necessarily as important as just positioning yourself for the now and for tomorrow.
And basically what we're talking about, we use the word positioning a lot, both of us. And I think where we get stuck as marketers is this push and pull where we're chasing a campaign, a moment, or we're strategizing around a asset. Or in the tech space, it might be like a white paper or a video or a case study. Like you're stuck at that lower level. Can you talk about the difference between an overall content umbrella strategy and then the subsequent assets underneath that? What should the relationship be? Because one without the other seems dangerous. How do we think about that as marketers when we're trying to build something meaningful and scalable and that actually works?
Ideally, it is all coming from the same brand purpose and brand promise. If you really sweat the top level, what does our brand mean and what does it mean to consumers, then every touch point underneath that should have a clear line to that. I think all the best brands in the world are very rooted in a brand purpose that you can feel in a email headline, that you could feel in a 30-second ad, that you could feel if you go on their website, that you could feel if you snuck into their office and just walked around the halls and looked at what was hanging on the walls. It's easier said than done, mostly because it takes a lot of commitment and I think a good bit of sometimes patience on everybody's part to make sure that we are not acting too quickly on something or being reactive without strategy or trying to reinvent ourselves every year because of minute to minute performance dips or peaks or things like that. I think companion messages that fit together, when you read one and read the other, those two things should build upon each other. They shouldn't contradict each other. So I always think that having creatives in the room and having the creative thought to look ahead to what that last piece of creative would be, even when you're talking about top level brand positioning, only make sure that you are creating a brand position that is as strong as possible. And when you have one that is crystal clear and can be summed up in 2 words or that just feels very tight and concise, then that ex copywriter or art director or social media manager responding to somebody's DM or complaint or something could really just look to those 2 words and know exactly what they should be saying. And that feels like a superpower of some brands, that clarity that really can just inform everything that they say and do.
What would you do if you're in, let's say, a business unit of a large enterprise and you don't have that clarity, but you still want to create a comprehensive, differentiated position? Is it a matter of trying to find a version of whatever you can discover as the brand purpose through a mission vision statement and apply it to your world? Like, how do you translate that if you're not the CMO of a large enterprise and you're still operating a business unit or something like that?
I think hopefully you could find something in your company's mission and vision that could give you, it might be a paragraph long, it could be just a quote that somebody, a C-suite person said in an interview. It could be something that just feels like it has some guiding principles to what your company is doing. Maybe it doesn't have to be so official that it is something that gets put on the company website. Maybe it is something that you decide with your internal team that here is going to be our sort of guiding purpose for this project, for our group, for our team, that obviously ladders up to what X person said or what it says X on this website, but something that just feels like, okay, looking around, we have this project on our table. It feels like it needs a promise or a platform that is going to really help us guide the voice and guide the vision for this project. Let's get the right people in the room to help us figure out what that is, the strongest, the sharpest, the toothiest version of that, the thing that is going to cut through. Because, like you said, you're talking about walking through a shelf of bourbons. Like, that's everything. The liquor store just happens to put it on display. Every HVAC company, and they're all one of several on a shelf. And so, what are the things that you can say, and how can you say it that gets you noticed? And finding that out and doing that work with some people and a whiteboard and a marker or however you want to do it first, I think will make the rest of that project a lot easier because everyone will be coming from the same perspective, will have that thing to look to and reorient themselves when it gets a little confusing like projects do.
I like the insight that you call back to when You're saying, can we find a quote? Can we find a mission statement? Because what you're seeking out is, I have something I need to say, but it has to be the truth. So can we make sure we're not saying something we can't back up or projecting something that we're not as a company, but we still have to be toothy and differentiated in this like commoditized space, which we all find ourselves in, right? As you're thinking about that. And then you look today and you're saying, okay, well, when I have that, now I have the complication that we talked about at the start, where there's so many different channels and I have to show up at events and I have personas and email marketing and industry applications and internal and external comms and increasingly complicated SEO landscape and product marketing, all these buckets to fill with content. And as marketers, we're drowning, right? Because we're not built necessarily to have that level of collaboration. If you look at any major marketing organization, all of those things sit in different places and everybody's just doing their own thing. And very rarely is everybody pulling on threads of the same message, right? So as you're thinking about these umbrella creative strategies, has your approach to creative in this multifaceted environment that we operate in changed? I think if you look back, you mentioned being in advertising, like it was easy to create a brand position 10 years ago. Like you create a really interesting spot, you run it as much as possible, and that's who you are as a brand. Like today, that doesn't exist, right? It exists, but certainly not at the magnitude it used to. So, how do we need to reimagine a creative strategy in this multifaceted world so that we actually can present ourselves in a way that is, I need my whiskey to stand out on the shelf, to your point. How do I do that in a world like this?
I think when you are so fragmented and a lot of your spaces are small and attention is in high demand and you're going to get 2 seconds of somebody's time, it's even more important now that your position is very clear and able to be understood in those 2 seconds, those two words. Like you said, there have been times when every brand had 30 seconds to get their position across. The best ones didn't need it. The 1984 Apple Think Different ad, Think Different. Like everything that led up to that was setting up that and was communicating that point, but they didn't need 30 seconds to get that brand position across. There are brands, I think, now that are still trying to communicate a position that takes too long than the time they have. And that is likely a product of not doing the heavy creative strategic work up front to know that in those moments when you only have 2 seconds, it's going to work. And so I would say that brand strategy has always been very important. But when you have to make so much more content and the quantity is high and the demand for attention is high and the amount of time that people are going to give you is extremely low, you have got to be very crystal clear and breakthrough in what you're communicating.
You brought up another sub point here, which is really important. You mentioned it in a couple of different capacities. When we started, you said the person on the other side of the conference call or the conference room table, how that impacts them and their world. Here, social media manager knows exactly how to respond and react. So not only is this an exercise to create a brand position, but from an internal comm standpoint, like how do you rally teams around the position you're trying to create? So having the clarity there so that truth expands and it gives purpose through the work that employees are doing as well, which we're starting to see in the brands that we're working on. A lot of questions around like, how do I bring my employees along? Like this lack of communication or involvement that they feel because they're doing a task that's way over here. How can they see that they're part of a larger vision or position? So I think there's downstream deliberate things that can be affected in a really positive way as you think about not only creating a brand position, but how do we operate as a company? What is our DNA? How do we explain that externally and internally, which often gets overlooked? And how does that change the customer experience? So I think that's really important. The problem that we discussed and you just articulated when we're thinking of all of the volumes and the types of content that needs to be created, and then fast forward to this rise of Gen AI, that Gen AI promise sounds really intoxicating as we think about it, right? All fast and free, and we can finally keep up with the demand, and the robots can create the content. In some ways, especially folks that don't maybe understand the value of content and positioning, and maybe because as brands and marketing organizations, it's been so distributed that value's gotten lost. So, as you think about the role of AI, what are the dangers in those waters? And because of that, should we avoid it altogether? Or is there a different way to think about how AI can play a role in scaling like those rich interactions that you just described with Jefferson's or Liquid Death and others?
I think AI is a tool. It's not going to be a wholesale solution. I think AI is going to make mediocrity a lot easier to attain. I think it's going to basically give every person the opportunity to create a C minus piece of work pretty easily. And I think that will fill a need places, but I don't think it will help any brands really get noticed if they don't have that brand purpose and point of view that informs what that AI tool is using. You still need to prompt AI. And if you are prompting them with something generic, it will give you a generic product. If you are prompting them with something that is coming from a very well strategized and creatively even worded or prompted place, it will give you something more creative and valuable back. There is an incredible amount of strategy and creativity that will go into how you prompt and how you direct AI, just the same way you prompt and direct teams. You're already seeing products come out from big toy companies just a couple of weeks ago who came out very proudly to say, look at this piece of brand creative we came out with, all using generative AI. Isn't it so great? It wasn't great, not because it was AI, but because the story that they wanted to tell was not resonant with consumers and it wasn't based in a creatively strong place so that the product, regardless of if it was made by a human or AI, wasn't going to be something that people cared about. I think there's going to be plenty of that because with the option to jump right into making creative, I think a lot of people will just jump right over the part that you ask yourself and do the hard work of what are we saying and why should our consumers believe it and how will it move our consumers to our product. I think there's also going to be parts of AI where when people do that work, they develop a great brand platform and they develop great creative. There's going to be possibilities that AI can help them. I think AI is going to be a tool that the best creatives use as a way of gathering insights, as a way of helping them pressure test strategies, as a way of helping them, using them almost as a tool to say, come up with where are 10 places that a person might bring a bottle of bourbon. And then you could use that as a way of informing stories you're going to tell. But I don't think it's ever going to be able to tell you the whole story, or it may at some point, but I don't think can yet.
Yeah, I think from our standpoint, we've played around with a lot of these tools and consistently underwhelmed when we ask it to think for us or create for us. And we've been really excited on the other side, which is what you described, which is how do I take something that is well thought out, well crafted, and do more with it? And that's a very exciting use case, but really only if you start with the end in mind, like you've hit over and over again, which is why does this matter? To whom does it matter? How do we build this differentiated experience? What are the touch points? What are all the things we need to say? Starting to build an insight driven story and then use AI to actually scale into all those places. Because doing that one asset at a time, my God, how expensive and time consuming. So starting to reimagine how we think about it and getting back to that opening question we had, which is it's harder than it ever has been, but not really, right? If we can start reimagining now, like this connected ecosystem of content that supports all of the different stakeholders and departments and use cases and touch points, and we think of a complete solution and we're doing the legwork and we're thinking creatively, that's really powerful. I do want to ask one last question here, which was really powerful. I heard you say this in another time, which is as you think about having something to say, that safe, generic middle lane is probably the worst thing you can do. And whether it's AI or human beings, just creating that vanilla, let's get something on this topic and move on, because you don't have that brand clarity to say, I know exactly what to say it, how to bring it to the world. Can you maybe talk about either tools or ways that as brands start to discover that process, like they probably stop too early to say, like, how would I say this? And how is it uniquely me? It's what do I want to say, not how do I say it? And then how do I think about that across all the different channels so that whether I get an assignment to do a asset or something like that, I know exactly how to go about it. So can you talk through how your team thinks and advises clients to think about that creative challenge?
Yeah, I think depending on the client, this can be something we do together. It can be something that is a little bit more of a almost external facing product or something that we create as a means of spreading to other team members. Or sometimes it's just something that myself and my creative team will do just to help us understand who this brand is. And I say who because I think the biggest thing is in an effort to make your brand more unique and relatable, it's like a process of figuring out if your brand was a person, who would that person be? Would you want to walk over to that person at a party and say, what's your story? Would you feel compelled to listen to them talk about what they do for a living? Would you want to invite them over for dinner? I think part of that is just understanding that people don't really like brands, but people like people. And if you can have your brand behave more like a person, I think more people might like your brand. And so sometimes it's just about asking, like, who does this brand feel like? And what does as a means of getting back around to say, okay, so what does that person sound like? How would we describe that person? If that person had to answer your complaint about our product, what would they say? And in the process of doing that, I think you just remove any of that somewhat ingrained corporate speak out of it. It's very easy when you're speaking about a corporation that's 1,000 people, thousands of people. You can go into sort of that corporate speak of optimizing and scaling and just things that people don't say. And like, how would you say it like a person? How would Woody Harrelson say it? If your brand is Woody Harrelson, well, you've probably got a pretty cool brand. I think get a lot of people who have worked in that office on that brand, lived it for 20 years to start looking at it and thinking about it differently because they feel maybe a little bit more connected to that personality than they expected. And it will unlock a way of even them talking about their brand to you that will create just a slightly new piece of truth that can be communicated. So I always feel like, and this is a product of working with great people for a while who have taught me this, but I think it's always best when if you look at a piece of language that everybody's rallying around and say, is this our brand? Asking like, would a person say this? And would I like this person? That I think is going to force you to answer that question honestly in a way that sometimes five people around a conference call or a conference table or in a annex wing of an office or something is they're maybe more likely to let something slide.
So as we think about this next wave of marketing and creative, where do you think people will start to stand out and shine? And where do you think people will run into problems and potentially fail? What do you think the determining factors are for success and failure as we go forward?
I think brands that put a premium on creativity and communicating in more relevant ways to their consumer will win when a lot of brands and companies are going to put a premium on cost effectiveness and communicating what they want consumers to know about their brand. It is really easy to just yell product specs at a consumer all day and then wonder why you're not converting on that cost, because you're telling them all the things that they should know, but you're actually telling them all the things you want them to know. And the more that you can understand that your consumer is only thinking about their needs, and if you can communicate to their needs, and one of their needs is to be treated with decency, not like a person holding a mouse or a person holding a phone that has a wallet, but a person who likes to be entertained and likes to be respected for their time and likes to be considered when something barges in the middle of the show they're watching or middle of their website they're scrolling and asks for a moment of their time. The more that those brands that treat that moment with care and with creativity and with eye for what the consumer wants first, those brands are going to continue to succeed.
So, as marketers are thinking about this, are there the opportunity for short-term wins in business outcomes? Because I think that's the challenge, right? Like we're in this pressure cooker where everybody has to show results yesterday. Feels like we need to almost take a step back to take a leap forward. How do you navigate the short-term pressure on business results while you start to build toward this much more sustainable future? Is it just messaging and patience, or are there things you can do in the immediate term to help make sure you're keeping the lights on?
I think it's going to be a product of trust no matter what. The people who are asking you to make product centered work today are hopefully the same people in the conversation that are trying to create a bigger brand purpose for tomorrow. When things need to be product level in your lower funnel and you need to convert sales, showing them that you can do that work still guided by a brand point of view and a brand promise and a brand purpose, that will only help them and give them more confidence to push for that higher brand level work. And I think in the process, help them fight for it internally too. There's, I think, so much of the process of making good decisions and strong strategic foundational decisions is done after the meeting and in the hallways after the meeting. And there's just going to have to be a moment of trust that you build together. That person that you're working with on the other side of the table, in the moments that you're not there, can still fight for that idea and fight for that thought. And one of the ways you do that is just by showing them that this works all the way down to when you need to sell product today. And the best positions will do that. And we're never going to get away from the moments we have to talk about the product and sell the product. But the more that we can build that foundation of purpose underneath it or above it, or however this metaphor works, I think that is just going to make people want to listen when you speak that way, because they know that you're more than that.
Awesome. So as we think of the path forward, really it's thinking and respecting the consumer, honoring those moments that you're asking them to spend with you, creating value and purpose, and understanding how they think about those worlds. Connected stories. So whether I'm seeing these larger market shaping moments or I'm getting an email. So starting to think about how we can take and craft stories across all of those different dimensions and personalize it. Really thinking about the role of human beings plus AI to scale message, not create message. And really starting with the why and the purpose. Like, what do we have to say? Why does it matter? And to whom does it matter to? It's getting back to the basics, but in a modern context. So really appreciate the time. Great insights, Max. Thank you so much. And I think everyone's going to take a lot out of this. So thanks a lot.
All right. Thank you.
Thank you for listening to Content Disrupted, brought to you by Skyward. To stay up to date on the latest ideas and insights in brand building and content marketing, visit our website at skyward.com. That's skyword.com. Join us for our next episode, where we'll continue to challenge marketing norms and inspire you with fresh strategies for growing business through brand storytelling.